Thank you, Johan, and of course, on behalf of all the organizers and especially Professor Reddy, I appreciate your time and thank all the panelists to make time for us. This discussion essentially runs for about an hour and 15 minutes. In the first part of the session, each speaker on the panel will have about 7 minutes, a minute here and there to put their views across. The second part of the session, of course, I will collect questions and have some interventions for the speakers. So either general questions or in specific. The third, of course, will be where we will again try and engage with our panelists on views and pointers that might add value to our participants. And of course, that will be about it. But we have with us today Mr. Vishnu Ramanikam, Mr. Ankur Kumar, Mr. Sanjay Tiwari, and Mr. Aditya Singh Chandel. Now, as Johan has just mentioned, the new COVID variant is upon us. But this era, this COVID era is upon us, and today, more than ever, the need and importance of the transport sector has become evident. In addition to not just hospital beds and doctors, it was in fact the transport sector, be it air, sea, or road, that has enabled the limited normalcy that we are right now experiencing. From vaccines to ventilators to masks to oxygen, they moved from one part of the world to another seamlessly in a seemingly connected world, which is through this sector. The sector did suffer immeasurable loss, of course, due to the drastic reduction in passenger traffic during these times of social distancing and containment. International as well as national traffic is yet to reach its pre COVID peak, of course, on account of newer variants which have now come on, like the Omicron. In fact, in Europe now they are saying it's called the Delicron, which basically is not a new variant, but the Delta variant and the Omicron variant together creating the havoc. Now, such reduction also puts a lot of pressure on cargo movements for the sustenance of the sector, and that too has hampered. The demand for goods is in fact in an increase. And major players like FedEx are in fact doing newer things like adding and upgrading more flights, connecting more regions, and offering enhanced flexibility to businesses to remain a top choice for global supply chain and logistical solutions. A few major themes, if I may just highlight, that large conglomerates in this sector are heavily invested in seems to be technology adoption in terms of touchless service rendering through drones and AI, customer experiences, value co-creation, agility in service design and delivery, flexibility in the provision of solutions to consumers or customers, etc. The opportunities that lay ahead for those interested in this sector are umpteen, but the skills required are unique and different. Today, we have an array of experts in this sector among us to discuss these nuances and more. Without any more delay, let us hear them speak and enlighten us with their inputs. So over to our speakers, Johan and Sagar.
Great. Nice to connect. Nice to be on this panel. I'm Vishnu. I'm a markets reporter for Business Insider, and I'm a long-form journalist for the Reuters. Jumping into the presentation. So I'd say supply chains have had a huge, massive impact because of the pandemic over the last couple of years. The fundamental unit of any supply chain, they're the businesses, they've suffered a lot because of various quarantining measures, because of the lockdowns also, and mostly because of their basic general inability to understand, forecast demand and supply equations, and also to understand volatility. They've also struggled in-house. They've struggled with finding and retaining labor, mostly because a significant part of the workforce was kind of disabled. So they were either scared to come back to work, or they had just migrated back to their ancestral homes. They were probably sick, or they were probably taking care of someone else who was sick in their family. So a significant part of this was scooped out of the system. So essentially the price of labor went up. And apart from that, I'm going to talk about this later on, but freight costs also went up because of freight shortages, freight capacity shortages. On the other end of the spectrum, while the businesses were being pummeled across whole spheres, we had the logistics service providers like carriers, container ships, or even warehousing operators. They were raking in a lot of profits. They had very good fortune over the last couple of years. But then it's also important to note that they've been quite powerless with trying to understand and mitigate the freight delays and the bottlenecks that we've been seeing in the system since the pandemic. So even though they control the assets, they control the equipment, they control the capacity, they've still been at loggerheads. They haven't found a solution to reduce all these freight delays. They've been pressured, yes, but they don't have a solution. I'd say the whole issue, the chaos that we see in the system today, it's very cyclical. The reason is, let's just cut to the chase. In the summer of 2020, you saw a lot of consumers being stuck in their houses. They were quarantining indoors, so they couldn't go out to buy their favorite stuff from their physical retail store. So what they ended up doing, in the absence of also spending on services, which they couldn't, they ended up clicking a few buttons on the computer or probably on their smartphones to buy something on an e-commerce channel, which incidentally has been a very big differentiator over the last year. So essentially, you had a lot of consumer demand in terms of total retail, physical retail volumes, or rather, sorry, CPG goods. We had a lot of volumes flowing in. So freight was coming in, but freight capacity wasn't because, like I said, the system was paralyzed, especially at the mid 2020. It was completely paralyzed, but you had a lot of volumes flowing in, so you had to push this, and that's where the pressure started. So that's where you had low freight capacity when there was surging freight volumes. So this lopsided supply demand equation essentially led to a situation where freight costs just shot up, like freight costs just went up because that's inevitable, right? So you have high demand and low supply, so the product in question or the service in question is going to go up, like the price is going to go up. So that's essentially what happened. And this fed into the next part of the loop where social distancing and quarantining and shortage of labor essentially delayed products from moving from one point to another, from moving from one node to the another. Freight delays were commonplace across the system over the year. And also because of these delays, you saw that capacity was categorically being removed from the system. So how does this happen? Let's simplify this equation a little bit. Probably just take a little warehouse, and the warehouse is probably serviced by 10 trucks. So let's say a truck in general takes about 5 to 6 hours to bring in the container or its cargo, unload it at the warehouse, reload back with an empty container, and then drive out of the premises. So this usually takes about 5 to 6 hours, but today in these extraordinary circumstances, you see that to extend for a day or two, or even probably 3 days. So truckers are essentially idling outside warehouses for several hours together, or even several days. And this, what does this mean? It means that in a situation where on a normal day, you have 10 trucks servicing the warehouse, you currently have about 5 trucks servicing and the other 5 trucks being stuck in different parts, just idling, queuing up in some yard. So essentially, this is further straining your freight capacity. So freight capacity is systemically being removed from the system, even as you have consistently high consumer retail demand. So as long as this demand doesn't go down, you never have any kind of a easing with the pressure that you see in the system. So I would say the pain that you see today is gonna extend at least till Q2 or Q3 next year. So what are exactly the ways through which you can improve your resiliency? So how can a business which is within the logistics industry, how can they stay resilient? The first thing I would say is for them to adopt digitalization practices. So you need to embrace digitalization techniques. Try to understand data, because data is going to be very important going into the future. So for starters, you try getting your data, collecting data from different operations within your workflows, and then trying to use that data to create insights out of them, and then use those insights to monitor your processes better, and also to have a bit more transparency into your system, right? So the second point would be labor welfare. So I would say labor is a critical component every day, if not today. Having labor prices have gone up, like I mentioned before. Labor shortages have been there, kind of prevalent across all spheres within the system. So companies need to ensure that they invest a lot into ensuring their labor is happy, that their workforce is happy to work as a community within the system. They're happy monetarily. They're getting proper compensation packages, even with regard to holidays and stuff. So apart from that, they also need to ensure they have retention programs where they hear the problems of their workers and try solving them. So it is very essential for companies not just to recruit or think of recruiting new people, but also to make sure that they retain the people they've recruited, which has been a huge problem traditionally within the logistics and supply chain industry. And the third point and the last point I want to mention is that companies need to attempt at least to create more partnerships and collaboration within their system. So it's not essentially just working with your vendors or your suppliers or your clients, but it's also about opening up, embracing the entire industry, trying to freely share data and insights. So this way, as long as companies start getting together, as long as the end-to-end supply chain stakeholders are coming together, it essentially, at the bottom line, you see that they can predict volatility better because they understand each other's businesses better, so they can collaborate and future-proof their operations together. And this probably is going to be the only way forward for them to stay resilient and flexible, and also to understand demand and supply equation. So that's it from my side. So thanks for the opportunity.
I think Pinaki sir, you're still there, or we could ask Ankur to, you know.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Ankur could go on now.
Thank you, Dr. Pinaki, for having me on this panel, and it's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this August panel. And today I'll be discussing and taking you through my experience on container shipping and what can be done to build resilience in the container shipping sector. Let me share my presentation with you.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So if you look at the very basics of what is ocean freight. Ocean freight or sea freight is the transportation of goods internationally by sea, and it is the most common form of transportation for importers and exporters. And in this context, if you look at the global trade has grown from $1.97 trillion in the 1980s to around $17.71 trillion in 2020. So to keep pace with such humongous growth of global trade, the entire transport sector has to grow. And this sector has grown, and due to this growth, a lot of complexity has crept in. And this also entails the importance of the ocean freight sector. Maritime or transport or ocean freight is the backbone of global trade and the global economy. Around 90% of all the international merchandise trade by volume is carried out and transported via ocean freight. And this is also one of the most preferred mode of transport for importers and exporters. That is as it is one of the cheapest mode of transport for majority of the traded goods. At any point of time, if you look at, there are around 20 million containers on the ocean. So taking into account all these statistics, you can imagine the kind of clout, the kind of position the ocean freight holds in the global transport sector. And moving on to the current pandemic situation, the current pandemic situation unfolded very unpredictably. Some parts of the world went into lockdown earlier in the early stages of the pandemic and were able to cope with the pandemic and come out earlier than other countries. For example, China. China went into lockdown fairly early in the early stages of the pandemic, and was able to come out fairly earlier than other countries, and this led to huge demand of containers, empty containers to China, because as you can imagine, China is the factory of the world, and this huge influx of containers, and then the outflux of container of manufactured goods in the containers to various other countries led to congestion at ports. This was not only because of the influx of containers at various ports. This was also made worse by the pandemic, the shortage of labor at various ports. For example, the China, the port in China, the Ningbo port was shut down for some days, and this ultimately culminated into rising freight prices. If you look at and compare from 2019 to 2021, the ocean freight has increased 8 to 9 times from 2019 to 2021. There were further impacts due to this pandemic. There were blank sailings, shortage of shipping containers, and shortage of capacity. This shortage of shipping containers and shortage of capacity was because most of the containers were either at sea or stuck at ports. And similar is the case with the vessels. They were either at the sea, stuck with loaded containers, and or waiting to berth at various ports. So, if you can imagine the kind of challenges that the entire container shipping sector has gone through, then you would want to see what kind of solution that can be used to mitigate those kind of challenges. The 3R approach is one of those mitigating frameworks that can be used to bring about resiliency in the sector. Talking about resiliency, let's first understand what is a resilient supply chain. A resilient supply chain is defined by its capacity for resistance to unforeseen shocks and recover on it in a timely manner. So to bring about this kind of resiliency in the container shipping sector, what kind of framework can the transport sector use? Can the container shipping sector use? Uh, this is the framework which entails the 3R approach: the readiness, responsiveness, and recovery approach to building resilience in the entire container shipping sector. If you if you look at readiness is the preparedness action to help a system avoid and withstand disruption. Now, how can you prepare a system to be ready to avoid and withstand a disruption or an unforeseen circumstances like the pandemic? This can be done through a number of steps, like risk assessment and resilience planning, by having a buffer capacity, digital process mining, that is to map your entire process and understand what kind of alternative network routes and nodes can be made available in case a pandemic or an unforeseen circumstances hit the supply chain. And risk audits can further help understand what kind of gaps are there in the readiness or preparedness of the transport sector. Similar is the next point when it comes to building resilience in the entire transport sector, especially in the container shipping sector. Responsiveness is the fast establishment of temporary capacity and networks. This can be done using standard operating procedures which come into effect once a pandemic or an unforeseen circumstances hits. For example, some weeks back, Pipavav was hit. Port of Pipava in India was hit by winds and rains, and it was shut for some time. But the other port did not have a buffer capacity to absorb the kind of shock, and the importers and exporters were left in lurch. So there has to be an effective standard operating procedures in place. Digital twin is the modeling and analytical framework where the exact replica of a supply chain is made, a simulation is made, and and can be tested based on various dynamic variables, so that there is an understanding there is a system level understanding of the entire supply chain. And when a pandemic hits, it's important that the system is resilient enough to recover from such unforeseen circumstances and recover in a timely manner. Recovery is restoration of normal performance of sector by repair of infrastructure and roads, measuring time to recover and time to survive. Now the time to recover is the time that a supply chain takes to recover, and the time to survive is the time that a supply chain survives without failing. So if the sector can measure the time to recover and time to survive, then the effective recovery process can be put in place. So the 3R approach, in fact, gives a framework where resilience can be built into the sector. Now, when I talk about the outlook for the sector, for the container shipping sector in the current prevailing pandemic, from building resilience to understanding what is going to be the near future for container shipping sector. With the new COVID variant spreading fast, the temporary port closures, regional lockdowns, and labor shortages is going to continue in 2022. There is a sort of repeat of 2021 where we will see temporary port closures, regional lockdowns, but the transport ecosystem will be prepared to deal with those kind of issues, since they have already faced those challenges in the past. But these will be there and will affect not only the commercial as well as the operational front. High ocean freight tariff is here to stay for the next year. Although capacity expansion by shipping line has been taken at a very fast manner, and the influx of new containers will be there, but it will not be sufficient to ease out the high ocean freight tariff. Similar will be the situation of shortage of container slots and shipping capacity. The slots or shipping capacity is going to be an issue even in 2022, because the kind of investment and the kind of time frame it takes for the shipping industry to build capacity is longer. So the same shortage of containers and shipping capacity is going to exacerbate the situation further. And and uh, and with these outlook or future predictions in mind, I'll close my presentation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankur. It was really wonderful hearing in the present and how we are preparing ourselves for the future. I thank you very much. And next, may I take this opportunity to invite Sanjay Tiwari to give his insights.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the previous speakers for laying the groundwork for what we're going to talk about. I have a couple of remarks that I'd like to make in general to set the context, and trying to anticipate also the fact that I presume much of the audience comes from a legal background. And then if time permits, I'll share a couple of slides with you as well. I agree to an extent with some of my previous speakers about their remarks about the shipping industry. I say to an extent because I've come from the shipping industry, worked for Maersk for many years, and before that for KLM. So I have a background, KLM Cargo, so I have a background in the ocean and the air sector, and have through the years seen a number of major disruptions, seen the SARS crisis, seen the economic meltdown of 2008, 2009, seen the Asian meltdown, 96, 97. Nothing compares, obviously to the kind of disruption that we've seen over the last 2 years. And I think it's driven home the lesson that all of us need to anticipate or learn to anticipate disruptions as much as we can, although the kind of disruption that we've just seen right now, qualifies as the ultimate black swan event and would have been very, very difficult to anticipate. I would argue, however, that behaviorally, a lot of businesses could have behaved differently and are learning to do so. And I'll make the point. I think that a lot of businesses are now learning to establish closer relationships with their partners across the supply chain. And in the years when I was, very active commercially at Maersk in India, I used to make the point to my customers that I cannot believe that when you're producing the kind of products that you are, and you're examining and exploring overseas markets, you're tying up with buyers overseas, you're planning everything 18 months ahead, that until 3 days before the goods actually have to be shipped, you still haven't made up your mind which shipping line you're actually going to be shipping to. That was literally the kind of relationship that most companies, a lot of companies had, because they were playing the dating game until the very last minute. That is now changing, where people are entering for much longer into much longer term contracts. And look at the likes of Apple, etc., who tie up their vendors years in advance. They don't decide at the last minute who's going to make a certain subcomponent for them. So I think there's a behavioral aspect to this. Secondly, obviously, there have been a lot of changes that have happened, in China, in the United States, with a surge in demand. I think the first speaker spoke about it as well. A surge in demand for certain products, a drop in demand for certain other products. A lot of products which were basically unsustainable. It's a very unpopular thing to say, but unsustainable from a shipping perspective. I would argue that in years to come, you're going to see those moving out of the supply chain altogether. A lot of things like recycled clothing, recycled, paper scrap, rubber tire scrap, etc., which makes up very, very significant amounts of container shipping, is going to find it hard to find a place in global supply chains. I would like to focus in the next couple of minutes on the people angle, which I think is extremely important. I now run and manage an e-learning company, an edtech company, and we focus predominantly on skilling blue-collar workers, companies called 21cc Education. And in a country like ours, 1.4 billion people, you won't believe that most logistics companies are finding it hard to recruit people. The surge in demand has been so huge. I read somewhere about 2 months ago that in this year, 2021, we've had slightly more than 800 million e-commerce shipments, okay, in India. That constitutes, we think, we don't have the exact figures yet, at least 3 to 4% of all retail in India over the last year. We don't have the data on that yet. A year ago, e-commerce was only 2% of retail in India. By now, it's bound to be at least 3% or 4%. That figure of 800 million shipments is going to increase to just under 3 billion shipments by 2025. So think about that. That's just under 4x in 3 years' time. Now, the effect of that on land and on buildings and on roads and on trucks and on forklifts, and most importantly on people, is already huge. If you are a recruitment manager today at an e-commerce outfit or a food delivery outfit, and these are the people that I speak to, so I know what challenges they're facing, and you think today is tough, fast forward to 2025, and your life is going to be living hell, because you will not be able to find enough people. So people, however underpaid they may have been, people, I mean frontline workers, people who actually bring these products to our doorstep, are for the first time beginning to realize their value and their worth. They're actually mapping out strategies. They're actually joining companies and saying, I'll work for company X for a couple of months at 10,000 rupees a month, 11,000 rupees a month. And then I'll go to the big A, Mr. Amazon, who pays 14,000 rupees a month, because I can then get a good entry there. So I think the first speaker spoke about it. Skilling people, training people, investing in them is going to be more important than ever before. And I've always said to my prospective customers, don't engage in training and skilling out of philanthropic reasons. Do it even as a hard-nosed business decision. Now, 2-3 years ago, seemed like a crazy message. Today, I can tell you, a lot of these PE-funded, VC-funded companies are realizing that if they don't invest in the skilling of their people, those people are going to vote with their feet and move out. In fact, they are. There are companies who, in less than a year, are churning their entire working population. That's almost impossible for us to imagine today. Imagine Tata Steel or any Tata company going through its entire working population in under a year. It's happening today to these VC and PE funded e-commerce companies that are growing at such an amazing speed. So investing in these people and showing that you have their best interests at heart is good for them, but it's also very importantly good for your business. I'll leave you with a stat in closing. In the United States, e-commerce by the end of 2019, early 2020 was 11% of all retail. And all of us in the business knew it would see a big jump. It has jumped by 3% in 1 year. So gone from 11% of retail to 14% of retail. Imagine this, in the largest economy of the world, a 3% growth in e-commerce. So the impact of that is huge. I think in India, we're just at the beginning of a huge surge in the logistics space, huge surge in e-commerce, and therefore a huge surge in the need and demand for skilled people. And with my company, 21cc, we're very glad to be able to play a very small role in addressing this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sanjay, for those insights and bringing in one of the most critical aspects of business, and that's people. They say in business, you have only really, truly, only one truly competitive advantage, and that is your people. There are companies which are built on their foundations of people, and thank you for highlighting that. With those words, of course, may I please invite Mr. Aditya Chandel for his insights.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Pinaki. I'll just share my presentation. Just give me a second. So, thank you so much for having me here. I would like to approach this particular topic or the discussion, from a legal policy and from that framework perspective. And this being, the insights or the inputs that I would like to share is from my experience, that I had during the pandemic, dealing with businesses and helping businesses cope with the changes, at least from a legal and regulatory perspective. And just to give you a background, I come from a tax and customs background, so there was a lot of discussion around these issues, especially when during the lockdowns. So I think what emerged, and as previously also the speakers spoke about, was about this whole thing of supply chains getting exposed, being very centralized or dependent on a particular source. Those were the themes, or those were the exposures that were highlighted. And from our experience, whether it was from a customs perspective, we are talking about international supply chains, or domestic, when you had these lockdowns where every other day there was a change in policy, or there was so much of flux that it was very difficult to cope with, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and how do you kind of keep up with it, try to explain to the authorities as to how critical, how integrated supply chains are. For example, if there is if essential goods are allowed, or manufacturing of essential goods are allowed, there could be a situation, as you would know, that there are a lot of things which go into that essential good, which independently may not seem that essential. For example, a packaging material or other inputs. So we faced a lot of those kind of challenges during, or the businesses faced a lot of those challenges during these lockdowns. So that was one theme, or one experience that came out of these change in regulations during the lockdown, and that obviously because of the way the supply chains are. Now coming to the other point, which I would like to kind of discuss, is the fact, and as Ankur talked about 3 Rs, I think it is very critical for our policymakers, for our regulators, for any supply chain now to be resilient. And again, I would like to add that after the initial hiccups that we faced in terms of regulations which were not clear or well defined, I should credit the government and the agencies to, they quickly came with clarifications, suitable clarifications, which helped the process smoothen up. So I think even from a policy perspective, regulatory perspective, for supply chains or logistics or transport to be resilient, the policy initiatives or policies also need to be flexible. And in that light, we also saw when we were talking to the businesses, and especially the multinationals, looking for, offshoring, or you can say moving their supply chains, not necessarily back to United States, but regionally, moving them around to diversify. And there was a lot of interest in India in that sense. And we also saw that this crisis also brought in a lot of opportunities in that sense. And accordingly, there were a lot of initiatives which were kind of taken by the government, which were already there. Some of the policy frameworks were already there, but there were also some initiatives which were kind of taken by the government. For example, if we look at the logistics sector, from an FDI, foreign direct investment regulation perspective, or external commercial borrowing perspective, norms have been eased for the transport sector, for the logistics sector. Now you can borrow money through the ECB route. So this was in 2017 when this route was open to this particular sector, which can help fund projects from foreign lenders, because obviously domestic, as you know, domestic lenders and domestic financial sectors is quite leveraged. So that was one. And as I mentioned, there was a lot of learning for us as well, and for the regulators and for the administrators during this process of reacting or being proactive to these supply chain hiccups. In addition to that, I think because I'm from a tax background, I also feel that when we are talking about resilience of a supply chain, it is very important for our regulations, our tax policies and laws to provide that certainty, um, and the policies have to be very, very clear and very certain. In that sense, we've seen government taking those initiatives, whether it's at the international level where our tax policies are being aligned with the global tax policies at OECD. We have entered into free trade agreements. There are free trade agreements which are in place and some are in the making, which again help that cooperation as far as international supply chains are concerned. And I think the biggest policy initiative, if I may say so, which have kind of helped logistics, and I think which kind of also provided that cushion during this phase, was this whole GST reform. Because obviously the multiplicity of taxes have gone, multiplicity of compliance has gone. It has reduced delays. Specifically, if I were to mention something out of GST, it is your e-way bill program, which basically now has almost reduced, according to one of the data points, around 15 to 20% of your transport cost and time has been reduced by just this single initiative under GST. There are, you move to a less compliance, you are digitizing a lot of these tax compliances, whether it's customs or GST have now gone online. So that is also helping in, smoothing the process. The other program which I think is related to customs is this whole AEO, Authorized Economic Operator program, which is kind of running very successfully. It has again reduced the time it used to take to clear a consignment from the port or for exporting out of India. So this program is also working well, and India as a country is kind of, we are getting into these agreements, bilateral agreements, where these programs are being recognized at a bilateral level. And this obviously would again, smoothen the process. So I think as I think Ankur mentioned earlier, and from our perspective, or from a legal and regulatory perspective, what seems critical is is the way the policy, how flexible is the policy, how fast do you react to the disruption, before to give time so that you react in a sufficient or in a suitable time, so that those supply chains can recover, as Ankur was mentioning. So I think that's been the experience, and I think from our perspective, or from a legal or a policy perspective, after this experience of COVID, I'm sure that governments or the Indian government will look at some of these learnings positively. And we have interacted with regulators, we have interacted with tax authorities, and they were quite so yeah. So I was saying that even from a government's perspective, uh, there's been a lot of learning. Uh, and we have interacted with regulators, we have interacted with government, so they are also very open to, at least from a regulatory and a process perspective, operational perspective, to make these processes much smoother, whether it's the customs process or whether it's under the GST or generally at the policy level. So they are quite open to these suggestions and making these supply chains more resilient in that sense. Plus, at overall level, if you see, India is also looking at policies where they want to take advantage of this situation, in the sense that they want foreign investments to come in, and there are uh, you know uh, schemes which have been launched. For example, the PLI scheme, which is to attract foreign investment or supply chains which want to move out of China or which want to diversify. So I think, and that also in a way helps even the domestic supply chains to get resilient in that sense. So I think some of these initiatives are important when we are talking about resilience of supply chains overall and the transport or the logistics sector otherwise, specifically. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. That was really wonderful hearing you out. So, Aditya, I think, Sagar, is it all right if I ask a couple of leading questions?
Yeah, you can carry on, sir. So now the panel is open, so you should, yeah, have the panel discussion with the questions. Yes.
Thank you, thank you. So I will take undue advantage of my position as moderator, and before it opens up for the audience, I will ask some of my questions, which are very interesting and have led me to ask, to this esteemed panel. One of the first questions that I want to ask, and I think maybe Aditya can give us some insight, but the RBI a couple of years ago, the RBI initiated something called a sandbox for fintech startups. A sandbox, policy sandbox, is where you come up with an idea and then you try it out and then see what works, and that becomes a part of the policy. Now, would you prefer something like that in the domain of logistics and the transport? Because the realities are harsh, and they keep changing. So the goalpost also keeps changing, and that is of course a serious issue. Would something like a sandboxing idea work in this sector?
So, just to understand it a little better, so when you say sandbox for this sector, what exactly are we saying there, or are we talking about?
So Aditya, so what the RBI did in terms of creating a sandbox, basically it's a regulatory sandbox where you imagine regulation, you put it into the sandbox, and then you try and imagine what are its impacts
Okay.
before making them really embedded into law. That hasn't been tried earlier. That was the first experiment in India, the RBI sandbox,
Yeah.
regulatory sandbox of fintech companies. Would you prefer something like that in this area of transport sector? Because I think one of the first things which get hit in any circumstance, be it the pandemic, be it a war, be it a terrorist act, it's the transport sector.
Yeah. So I think from if in my view, any such a initiative should always be welcome, because obviously you get to uh, try the policy or the legal framework out before it is made applicable, and you also get to know about where the system or the regulations can be improved in that sense. So I'm sure this would be this should be helpful, and as you rightly said, it has only been tried from a policy perspective in the sphere of fintechs. In any case, if I were to look at it from a customs perspective, some of the initiatives that the government has done, or in the past, how these initiatives have been implemented, is that you run a pilot project. For example, if there is a particular process that you want to introduce, or you want to smoothen the process of at operational level, then you do it in the form of a pilot project running at a particular port. Or you want to do digitization, you do it in terms of at a particular port, or in a particular area, so that you try it, you test it, and then you come out with a better version, if basis what your experience has been. So I'm sure this will, and this can be tried.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you. So the
Dr.
next question, of course.
Dr. Patnaik,
Sorry, go ahead.
to add to that, the sandbox idea of having initiatives as a tryout, as a pilot venture. So government has been toying up with this idea. For example, the port community system, the PC system that is there at major ports. So it started as a pilot initiative, as a digital pilot initiative. So this kind of idea is, I believe, is beneficial for the entire sector, where you get to try out this idea and understand what kind of implications this can have. So definitely, this is a well thought out move, if it can be implemented in an impactful manner.
Thank you, Ankur. In a broad sense, with the new Omicron variant, and now the government of India, our Prime Minister has just announced that there'll be booster doses for those above 60 with comorbidities, and also to our frontline health workers. We have now also taken into the ambit anyone who's above 15 to be rendered a vaccine. A newer Zydus has gotten its approval. How do you think the transport sector reacting to announcements like this? Are they already prepared, or do they get a heads up? I mean, suddenly if you come and say, well, 2 days from now we will have 2 million people vaccinated. Now start. How does the transport sector react to announcements like this?
Professor, I can take this question. So, when you say how the transport industry is going to react, to be plain simple, I don't think they react to this. So essentially, it is the prerogative of the producers, the vaccine producers, who have to put stuff on schedule to ramp up the number of vaccines they're producing every day, rather than the transport industry. Because if you look at the transport industry, the segment that works for vaccinations is usually the cold storage segment. So it could be reefers in terms of trucks, and it should be aircrafts on which all these containers are moved. Nothing goes via truck, I think, unless it's short distance, which goes through reefers. So to answer your question, I would say transport providers pretty much work the same way. They have enough capacity. It's going to be, the capacity is going to remain the same. You're not going to add new capacity in a week or a couple of weeks. It takes months. So I would say the first person or the first stakeholder who's going to be alerted would be the producers, would be the vaccine producers, who would have a lot of contract freight capacity themselves. And if not, if they have to exceed, they are going to go into the spot market and buy their capacity. But this has like literally directly, there's no big impact because of the Prime Minister mentioning anything.
Thank you, Vishnu. A lot of the times, many of our esteemed speakers have brought in the concept and the question of technology, and how technology will probably act as an enabler for this sector, or even technology as the next best thing for this sector. And we have also spoken about digitization of this sector, and how digital infrastructure needs to be enhanced. When we talk about these kind of things, for the benefit of our audience and as well as me, can you just elaborate a little bit on what do we mean by digital infrastructure? Does it mean that drones will be flying along, the ships, the cargo ships, and giving us real-time data as to the weather patterns, or choppy waters, or I don't know, in the worst case scenario, maybe pirates? What kind of digital data will we have, and what do we actually do with the data? Some broad-based questions, I think. If I may invite again uh, Ankur to this question, and then of course to Vishnu.
Right. So when it comes to digitalization, it is essentially the usage of data from various sources along the supply chain, and to come out with insights using that data, and implementing a solution that would help ease out challenges either in communication, either in transference of physical documentation, or in transfer of financial communication. For example, the bill of lading. Bill of lading is physically transferred and has to be physically submitted to a shipper, and this creates a lot of challenge. So using blockchain uh, for transference of bill of lading, and identification of user, or the shipper as the owner of the bill of lading. So these kind of initiatives uh, are called the digital initiatives that helps in easing out those challenges.
Can I just weigh in here for a minute, please, from an industry perspective? Is
Yes,
that okay?
yes.
Yes.
Right. So, there is actually a lot more, there are a lot more digital resources already being deployed by the industry than I think we give the industry credit for. And you're just asking, do we have advanced information on weather patterns, etc. I mean, companies like Maersk, for whom I've worked, but with the other large shipping lines as well. But Maersk in particular has a major operations center headquartered here in India. All of the vessels that operate for Maersk are monitored on a 24/7 basis by an operations team sitting here in India, and they are looking at data such as this on a round-the-clock basis. So indeed, weather patterns, or are there threats of piracy, etc. In addition to that, there are a lot of data loggers now getting attached, not just to reefer containers, but dry containers. So people are gathering a lot of information on that as well. Ankur was just speaking about blockchain. Well, you have an initiative called, it's not an initiative, it's a business called TradeLens, which is a joint venture between IBM and Maersk, and that actually uses blockchain technology to trace the ownership of cargo, to actually manage the handover of cargo. So, instead of 300 or 400 pieces of paper being, changing hands in the lifetime of a shipment from one part of the world to another, it's now an entirely digital process. And major terminals around the world, including terminals here in India, China, etc., have all signed up to TradeLens, so they provide information and they gather information as well. So there's a lot more happening in this domain than we give it credit for. And I, to an extent, Vishnu, want to just also counter you on a point you made in your very early presentation, saying that shipping lines are not really able to get ahead of the disruptions. I think actually, given the successive waves of disruption that have happened over the last 2 years, and the insane spikes in demand and drop-offs in demand, and the fact that, say, in Long Beach, in the United States and California, containers couldn't even be shipped out for many months because there just weren't enough employees available to handle them. I think under those circumstances, shipping lines have actually done a pretty decent job. I think the disruption could have been a lot worse were it not for the fact that you have men and women in India, Europe, China, etc., trying to manage these disruptions. So those are some of the points that I would want to make in this context.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you very much. And now that we have been talking, and this is the last one from me. I know Sagar's probably grinding his teeth now and saying that I'm hijacking the whole show. But just to push an agenda forward, all of us today are very conscious of the environment, and there are issues more than one which have already come to the fore about the impact of air and sea and road transport on the environment. And how are we actually preparing ourselves, the sector, how is it preparing itself to meet the environmental targets? And in this already carbonized world, if I can use that term, I think we will take responses from each of our esteemed panelists, and we can start with Sanjay and then go on to Ankur and Vishnu and Aditya.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Patnaik. We had a similar question coming up on a panel with some people in the UK a few weeks ago, and it led to a lot of introspection because I think obviously the industry has egg on its face. There's a lot to clean up. A lot of negative impact on the environment from the global transportation industry. Although as an industry, it's designed to be as efficient as it can. So when we were on that panel discussion, somebody said, how can we encourage the transportation industry to be more efficient? Well, actually, you don't need to, because it's the one industry that seeks to maximize every single container slot or every single cubic meter of space on an aircraft, etc. Because every lost bit of space is lost revenue. It doesn't come back. The odd thing is that with the e-commerce industry, collectively, all of us, and this is where we as consumers have a guilty part to play, for the first time, you're subsidizing inefficiency. Look at most of the trucks that deliver e-commerce goods to your doorstep. We're subsidizing the rates to such an extent collectively, because the amount of low-cost money flowing into it, PE money, VC money, that it's okay for you to order something on Amazon or Flipkart, say, click, I need something, and 5 minutes later say, click, I need something else, and 5 minutes later say, click, I need something else, and for 3 separate parcels to arrive at your doorstep. That's unthinkable, right? When you go to a supermarket, they don't give you 3 different bags, they at least put this stuff together. So in the traditional freight industry, there was still a drive for efficiency. In e-commerce driven world, things are becoming almost by design inefficient. And I'm sure you all read about this new app, I think it's called Zepto, which was valued at $60 million a few weeks ago and is now valued at a few $100 million. And what's their proposition? To ship goods to people, deliver groceries in under 10 minutes. Our desire for convenience has become so insane that it's forget about same-day delivery, forget about same-hour delivery. This is under 10-minute delivery. So collectively, as an ecosystem, we're saying, let's go and fund these two 19-year-old guys, and they can get groceries to us in under 10 minutes, right? So what price convenience? Now, you can do the math on what the environmental impact of all of these new Zepto drivers is going to be, that they have to get the goods to you in under 10 minutes. So I think that's a negative side. I think there is a shift by some of the airlines. KLM is one of them, towards biofuels. Maersk has announced a couple of vessels 4 years from now that will run on methane, around 6 vessels. So that's a shift to a slightly cleaner form of fuel. But the basic fuel that's used by container vessels is a highly polluting source of fuel with huge sulfur emissions, etc. So it's not a clean industry by any stretch. The last point I would make, in addition to what I said about e-commerce, is think about what we as consumers buy and order. So when you look at what's in containers, I mentioned metal scrap, recycled clothing, waste paper. Think about the trees from the Amazon that get torn down. It's not just all being consumed in Brazil. It's you and me in India or in China actually buying that tropical hardwood. But that's the secret thing we all like to keep a secret. So we just think it's really bad what happens in Brazil. But it's us as consumers actually say, yeah, we need a new teak door in our apartment building and pay for that. That's where that wood is coming from. So I think when you look at the environmental aspect, I think there's a lot of introspection that's going to have to be done by a lot of us as industry players, but also as consumers.
Thank you, Sanjay. Can we have Vishnu with his inputs?
No, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, Vishnu, go ahead.
Great. I agree with a lot of points that Sanjay made, and I would probably start out with a little incident I had with DHL. I was talking to them about a couple of weeks back. So they were talking about how packaging is detrimental to the whole idea of reducing emissions within the industry, because with the rise of e-commerce, you see that the parcel package sizes are going down in terms of the volume that you're shipping per package, it's going down, while the frequency of sending out packages is going up. And this is literally because of e-commerce. So e-commerce literally in a warehouse, if you're putting e-commerce stuff in a warehouse versus stuff which goes for a physical retail store, on average, people find that the volume of packaging is 3 times more. So let's say you're sending out 100 units of a pencil. Imagine you're packing every pencil into a different package and putting it out there. So you're gonna use that many more packaging material. So DHL finds this to be a huge problem. I'm sure that all kinds of parcel and package carriers also have this problem. And the second part about this emissions issue is today, in the last couple of years, because maritime prices have gone up like 3-4 times, probably in the US 5-6 times, depending on the trade lane you're getting your services on. People are actually finding it easier and more cost effective to go through air rather than maritime networks, simply because air, even though it's more expensive, it used to be 10 times, 12 times more expensive. Now, because of the jacking up of prices within maritime, you find it to be just like 3 or 4 times more. And also with maritime, you're gonna put your stuff, there's demurrage and detention costs, there's delays with vessel congestion, there's delays with drayage. So you have a lot of delays there. So comparatively, a lot of bigger big box retailers, for that matter, even Amazon, they've been chartering a lot of freighters. So a lot more air freighters are moving in. So this means that emissions, again, the whole idea of capping emissions just goes out of the window. So this is again a huge problem. And also to this point that Sanjay made, that maritime vessels are using, are polluting a lot more. So I would say it is reducing a little bit because of IMO 2020, low sulfur fuels. At least they've reduced it, I think, like 3-4 times when compared to the fuels they were using before 2020. So I think that kind of helps a little bit, but that's also putting undue pressure on maritime container lines. So I would say the solution to emissions is to ensure that you use a lot more sustainable packaging materials, and you reuse a lot of packaging, which is a big area right now, especially with returns packaging in e-commerce. It's a big deal right now, at least in the US. And then there should be a lot more consolidation. I think, speaking from a macroeconomic perspective, I'd say that if the industry is a lot more consolidated, like in the maritime industry, the industry, they I mean, I don't like using this word, but they say it's the maritime container cartel. So this cartel kind of controls around 85 to 90% of all freight flows in the maritime market. So this essentially should be the way forward for most other modalities, including the trucking market, which is highly fragmented today, not just in India, across the world. So we need to reduce the fragmentation, consolidate different assets and equipment, and this way we get more transparency and visibility into what's happening. And just segging into the point about technology, having more technology again creates more visibility. So bottom line, I would say more consolidation, higher transparency, and more sustainability and reusing of packaging. This would be the way forward to, considerably make a dent in that emissions problem.
Thank you, Vishnu. I think I'm reminded of this term the yin and the yang story. There's a good in all bad, and there's a bad in all good. But thank you very much, Vishnu. Now, can I invite very quickly Ankur?
I would like to approach this question from the perspective of domestic logistics. Domestically, 70% of the freight moves by road and only around 25 to 30% move by rail. And this movement of 70% of freight by road creates lots of pollution in the country. And if a way could be found out to have the model shift from the from road to rail, which is currently at 30%, this could eventually lead to a lot of reduction in emissions in the country. Now, if you look at the solution on how this can happen, is to build intermodal terminals, to build multimodal logistics park and intermodal terminals. Why normally people use road as a primary or a preferred mode of transport is because the service is point to point. Now, if you have intermodal terminals or multimodal logistics park, which not only offer the convenience and cost efficiency, uh, the convenience of road and cost efficiency of rail by providing the middle mile or the long haul by rail and last and first mile by road, then it can drastically reduce emissions. And before we question the maritime industry, let's first question ourselves on what we can do in the country to reduce emissions, and how can we bring about a change, a model shift, and how can we force the government to undertake policy initiatives and undertake laws so that such modal shift can happen, and a favorable regime for development of intermodal transfer terminals and multimodal logistics park can happen. Then this will definitely have a huge impact on the environment in the country.
Thank you, Ankur. Can I invite Aditya for his inputs?
Sure. I think very quickly, I think some of the points have already been made, and I think from taking from Ankur's point, uh, I think as Ankur mentioned, there needs to be some policy support and some legal support, in terms of maybe coming out with incentive schemes for promoting these logistics parks or setting up of these logistics parks. So that is one, I think that's one thing that a government should look at, or we should push the government to kind of come up with these policies and schemes. The other, I think the other shift which can again I'm talking from a domestic perspective, is this whole thing about electric mobility. Right now I think the government's focus, or generally the focus, has been on passenger vehicles. The whole policy is focused on passenger vehicles, and I can understand that because obviously it takes time to adopt that, and there is a greater push from the government for it, including your charging infrastructure and other related infrastructure. So I think the other thing, or the other important thing, at least from a domestic perspective, would be to start now supporting or subsidizing or helping electric mobility in this sector. So yeah.
Thank you, Aditya. That was really well done. I think if not anyone else, then Arvind Kejriwal has already heard you. So he is asking Ola and Uber to transform all their taxis into EVs. Good point. Thank you very much. We have some very interesting questions coming in from our attendees. I think I just let the attendees ask. Zahid Hussain has his hand raised. So Zahid, if you want to ask a question, can you please go ahead?
Maybe in the meantime, if I may jump in, Pinaki sir. So I think one point we haven't touched on is about the whole labor shortage. I know briefly it was mentioned, but I think we need to reflect a little bit, whether it's, I think probably with Ankur and Sanjay, maybe you could reflect, how the labor shortage issue is going to impact, the whole sector. Also because, we see there's a huge growth in the automation side of things, whether it's the warehousing or everything is interconnected. If you want to have a strong supply chain, then everything is quite well, should be connected. So when we talk about automation on one hand, which means that a number of these jobs, or some of these jobs might be redundant. So how do you balance that? So you have labor shortage already, but then we are working towards this whole automation, which will make some of the jobs redundant. So maybe from a skills perspective as well, especially Sanjay sir, maybe you can reflect, what is it that the next generation of workforce should be looking at?
Sure. Thanks, Sagar. I think what you just mentioned is not necessarily a clash. Therefore, I think automation will help us to leapfrog certain things. In India, if you look at currently our amount of manpower, say per square foot, all warehouses have a certain metric. We are slightly more inefficient than countries in the West. So typically, there if they have 100 people per 100,000 square feet, one employee per 1,000 square feet. We tend to have 130 per 100,000 square feet. So it's slightly more inefficient, which increases our need for more and more people. And the more people you get, the more inefficient the whole operation becomes. So actually introducing automation there, but skilling people to handle that automation is becoming a key thing. So now when you talk to the supervisors in these warehouses, they'll say, I need 6 experienced scanners for tomorrow, because he's just won a new contract. He has to do something for Whirlpool or Philips or something. And he says, I need 6 experienced scanners, people who know how to scan, who can do it within a certain amount of time. So they're getting very specific about that kind of thing. So I think, operating the drones, one of you spoke about it already. A whole lot of warehouses use drones to do stock counts, because human beings in any case are very bad at doing that kind of thing. I know from experience, I've done stock counts in my early career. It's a horrible experience and you always get it wrong. So now when you have a drone hovering over a bin and the drone counts how many pieces of a particular product there are, it's much more accurate, it's much more cheap, the drone never gets tired, you just need to recharge the batteries, you're done. So I think that kind of technology introduction is going to help us leapfrog. The other thing is, for example, driverless cars, etc., which we all think driverless cars means uncle and auntie and their kids are going to go off on a holiday and Uncle G doesn't have to touch the steering wheel. Well, I don't think that's going to happen too soon, but driverless cars are going to happen where in delivering groceries, right? Especially to gated communities, etc. Now that means you need a person who manages that network of driverless cars and bots that's going out to make those deliveries. So that's going to be one thing, because all of these businesses like these food delivery companies and the 10-minute grocery delivery company, they're very quickly in the next 2 to 3 years going to start hitting the barrier of the number of people that actually want to do this kind of work. We are going to start running out in urban India, at least, of the number of people that actually say, yeah, I'd like to spend 14 hours a day on a motorbike, zipping around, delivering stuff to people. So that's where I think automation will start to play a role, hopefully.
Ankur, how would you see that from a shipping standpoint, because there's so much of automation taking place, and is there any specific view you have?
Right, Sagar. Skilled labor shortage is definitely an issue in the shipping sector. But introduction of technology is going to make certain jobs redundant, but it also open doors to other jobs. So skilling from a company perspective is very important to for the way Mr. Sanjay has put in his first discussion, that it should not be done out of philanthropy from a company's perspective, but as a necessary part of improving employees. So yes, skilled labor is an issue in the sector, and introduction of technology is not going to make jobs go away. In fact, it will open doors to new jobs and with people with better skills.
Vishnu, you have a view there, maybe from a much more broader perspective, because you might be talking with a number of other stakeholders as well, not just the operators.
Yeah, for sure. Even within maritime, I wanted to add a little plug there. So I would say automation with regard to terminals That's going to be massive in the future. Everywhere across the world, automating terminals and terminal operations is happening, especially with yard automation. So I work, incidentally, with a lot of automated yard developers. Like they develop the software and they also develop the forklifts that are completely automated. So they tell me this is a big deal going forward, simply because of labor shortage. You have a huge problem with labor, so you don't find enough people, so you have to automate all your assets. Even though the money you put up right at the start is going to be much higher with regard to automation, the return on investment is pretty high too. So I would say automating yards, most definitely forklifts within a very geofenced location, that's going to be the future. With regard to automation, driverless cars and stuff, I would say it's still way, way in the future. I would say 2040 in India or 2045 in India. I would say even in cities like New York, or New York is even harder. I would say Phoenix in the US, that's where it is like the kind of like the epicenter of automated vehicles. So you have a lot of automated truck companies which service the trade lane between Phoenix and Los Angeles. So you have a lot of automated trucks moving there. But the important thing to note here is these automated trucks work in locations where you don't have a lot of different use cases, where you have people just jutting in with their shopping bags and on their smartphones just crossing the road without checking the signals and stuff. These automated vehicles can only work in interstate highways, like places where you have much reduced chances of having people or different erratic use cases coming into a train. So the first place where we would see large scale automation within transport would be mid-mile long haul trucking. So it's very important. Mid-mile is I'm sure you know that. So mid-mile and long-haul trucking is where you're going to have automation in the future, and already is existing in the US and some parts of Europe. I think they're testing. So this is where you're going to have it probably in the next 5 years. The next stage would be, and also forklifts, of course. Any geofence locations, they can have automation. The next stage probably would be remote controlled operators for the last mile delivery segment. Again, not driverless cars, but more like pavement bots, which are happening again. But I also incidentally did a story on this where you have a lot of vandalism, which you never consider in terms of technology. You just think, okay, a pavement robot can move from a warehouse and deliver and come back, but it's not the same way. Let's say you go through a locality which is very prone for vandalism. They just literally take it, open it, take the stuff and throw away the robot. And this has happened. Sometimes they just find it, they're frustrated, they just chuck it into a nearby pond or something. So how do you protect these assets? It's all a big problem right now. The real case scenario is a lot different than what you do in a laboratory while designing your robots. So I think automation needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. Having labor shortage needs to be addressed in a different way. I wouldn't say combining labor shortage with automation is the right way to go forward. I'd say, like Sanjay mentioned, like reskilling, upskilling people is very critical, and it should be done. It is completely different from the automation part of the equation. You need automation. You also need to skill up your labor force, because like Ankur mentioned, labor isn't going anywhere. It would just transform into a different, segment, or probably to a upskill segment within the company, but it's never going to go away. So in essence, I would say automation is very exciting, but we need to take it with a pinch of salt, even as we, make sure we focus our collective energies in improving the labor that we have right now. And then also trying to, encourage people to join in by improving the standards of working in different parts of the industry.
Yeah, thank you, Vishnu. So maybe for Aditya, I will take another 5 minutes maximum, but one question to Aditya very quickly, because we also received, I see that in the questions here, because the government of India is also planning to amend the labor regulation, whereby they would like to reduce the working duration up to 4 days a week. So, again, labor shortage, but then you also have a policy or at least some kind of an amendment that is going to go through. So probably, you know, yeah, I don't know how you see that. Maybe the what do you call yeah, it's quite difficult to balance that, I suppose. Aditya, how you see that? I mean, with all these reduction in work hours and, of course, improving working conditions is very important. But
I think from a reform perspective, if you look at just the reform that we are talking about, obviously it's positive. And as you rightly mentioned, that you need to look at labor reforms, and also generally the experience. And I think some of the panelists, my co-panelists, alluded to it earlier, is that you are right now in all industries. I would even say that even in a legal industry that I come from, there is a shortage of good talent or manpower in that sense. So and the key there again is to retain good talent, have some of these programs or welfare schemes in that sense. uh, so I would look at it positively in the sense that it helps you look at people in that sense, or come up with these welfare measures which kind of help you retain the talent in that sense. And also the kind of stress that people have gone through during the pandemic. You need to give them some of these cushions, and all these points get linked with the fact that there will be pressures of automation. There will be some losers, some winners in automation. The question is, how do you balance this whole thing? Like upskilling is one way of balancing it. So somewhere I think people are getting, at least the pandemic experience has been that all of us are, as employers or as employees, are getting conscious of that these are very, very critical things, and you need to come up with these policies, whether they are your internal policies or at the legal level. These are going to be important. So I think that'll be my broad reaction to a change like this.
yeah, no, thank you. I think, yeah, the balance is probably the most important thing here, especially with you don't want unions to be back of you. But on the other hand, yeah, it's important, working conditions are all the more important these days. So one last question is to all the panelists. Maybe I'll start with Sanjay. What does 2022 hold for the supply chain and logistics sector? What could be one or two predictions that you could do for the sector, or what is it? Or if you have one or two things that you would like to point out, whether it's a policy reform or whether it's any business related hiccups or bottlenecks that you see. So maybe this question is to all the panelists. So just a reflection, what is it that you really predict, or your prediction in line with some policy reform or any other reforms that you would like to see that
Right.
could have a positive impact or maybe a negative impact as well on the sector.
Sure. Well, I won't risk a prediction, but certainly I'll voice a hope. And also having worked on a policy document on behalf of Maersk recently for this, but I hope that with the government's increased focus on transportation and logistics, that a lot of work gets done to bring the work of different government departments closer together, because I think it's for the first time in a long time that logistics is becoming a national topic. And I think to that extent, the pandemic obviously helped in a big way, because we are aware of also how the industry has helped all of us. And sitting at home, we were still being able to get fed, etc. But I think different ministries, whether it's roadways, whether it's the shipping ministry, whether it's the finance ministry, the customs department specifically within of that, we are now realizing how all of these need to work much more closely together. And a lot of the cost of logistics in India is driven by goods not moving. And we've done the research into this. So, logistics is one business where the product needs to keep moving all of the time in order to keep the cost as low as possible. Each time that a department doesn't speak, if you have a PCS system for the terminal and customs has another system, and they say, no, bring me a slip of paper, then I'll enter it into my system. All that while that product, those goods are sitting on the ground, they're not moving. That's the biggest driver of cost in India today. And People keep talking about the cost of logistics being 14% of GDP. In all honesty, nobody knows if it's 14% or much higher or potentially lower. But we do know that in the United States, it's under 8.5 to 9%. So it's significantly lower than what we believe it to be here in India. A lot of that comes from the fact that goods are not moving fast enough. So my hope would be that the government, as part of this Gati Shakti program and the national logistics policy, etc., will actually focus on the interplay between government departments and ministries to make sure that goods move much faster than they do today.
Thank you, Sanjay. Ankur, is it fall or rise of the logistics and supply chain sector? To be more precise, also in line with the conference theme, what would your reflection be?
I can only add one thing. That one thing what I see is since the sudden spike in ocean freight has put every shipping line in center stage. So what I see is intervention from various governments, like from the Federal Maritime Commission of United States, and in a similar manner in India also, to go after shipping lines to audit the kind of costs that are involved in moving containers. Because as one of my co-panelists mentioned, it is sort of a maritime cartel. So one thing I see is government intervention in ocean freight tariffs.
Okay, thank you, Ankur.
Sorry, before you go to please. Vishnu, but Ankur, I'm going to politely, and it's okay because that's what makes a panel more exciting, but take issue with that. So Vishnu used the word earlier. I strongly dispute the fact that there is any such thing as a cartel of shipping lines. I've only spent, the last 1.5, 2 years, you've seen a huge increase in rates. Nobody over the last 20 years that you've seen the biggest decrease in rates, documented by almost any industry. Nobody's come out and said these shipping lines form a cartel. So I would just want to publicly disagree with the fact that there is a cartel. Number one. Number two, any attempt to start regulating rates, and this pops up all over the world. Malaysia said we ought to do something. Turkey said we ought to do something. Yes, the FMC in United States has made noise about it. The moment you do that, you're killing free trade, and it'll actually have a detrimental effect on the movement of containers. I just want to very publicly say that because it'll actually reduce the inflow of containers into India. So I think we have to find a way to remove roadblocks, like I was saying earlier. But I would strongly argue against saying, oh yeah, now we'll tell you. That's going back to, I would say, India in the 1970s. We'll tell you what to charge, how many containers you get to move, etc. I mean, that is going to have a counterproductive effect, if I may politely suggest that.
No, I think we worked very hard to deregulate the whole sector, or put down all these capacity constraints and all, or at least not to have discussions on capacity. But we are getting there. I think the other day we were discussing, or I was discussing with Aditya, are we in compliance with all these WTO rules, given the fact that everyone is talking about made in India, made in US, made in France. So that whole thought process of more and more protectionism or building in that kind of mentalities is growing. So I think, yeah, I think your views are very wise, Sanjay, there. So hopefully somebody's hearing you or listening to you. Vishnu, you have anything else to add?
I also kind of agree completely with what Sanjay said, and that was why I had a problem with using the word cartel when I mentioned it, because I really don't think that gun-toting, drug trafficking people being called cartels and the same word being used for container ship lines, but I would say the problem right now, with regard to 2022 forecast, I really don't like doing forecasts, especially in this kind of a setting, because I mean, all the forecasts are kind of ending up in the dustbin, So, but then I would say, macroeconomically speaking, this is the time for the workforce. So over several years, workforce has been treated just like another entity within supply chains, but now they're probably going to be more at the center, or more like the epicenter or the linchpin of the supply chain economy. So I believe that labor wages would still keep going up, and we'd have a huge problem with the older workforce, the boomer generation moving out, retiring, and the millennial and the Gen X generation who are finding it are kind of skeptical to join the workforce because they find it to be hard labor. So I would say over the next year and a few more years in the future, that'd be a slow transition of the redundant labor going into automation, and the rest of the labor basically being upskilled and being moved into more respectable positions within the company. I'd say data is going to play a much bigger role in the future. Like every single day, we are seeing more inclusion of data within operations. You'd have, again, in a macroeconomic perspective, big firms and businesses are going to understand the importance of supply chain. They're also going to drop off this idea of just-in-time manufacturing and putting stuff in on the production line. They're going to probably have more inventories because of the kind of problems you've seen, especially within the auto segment, with the semiconductor chip crisis, which is essentially like a $10 chip, which is stagnating a $30,000 or a $40,000 pickup truck from moving out of its production center. So you see such big problems. So people are going to be more guarded with where they're getting their sourcing from. So they're going to be more diversified, not just with China, Southeast Asia, but they're probably going to move a more, closer home. So they'd be sourcing very close to their production centers, probably have buy more contracts with regard to warehousing, build their own fulfillment centers with regard to e-com or big box shippers. So there's going to be more vertical integration again, which segs into the same point. These are my predictions. I think we'll have more consolidation, more vertical integration between different nodes within the supply chain. We're going to have more diversified sourcing going into the future, and labor is going to be more expensive, and more, companies would be more protective of their workforce.
Thank you, Vishu. So last but not the least, I want the legal thinking here, or Aditya, any closing remarks,
Sure.
legal or a policy standpoint?
So I think, I agree with the point that Sanjay made about, there being at least from an Indian perspective, departments or governments, various departments talking to each other. Because what you often find is that we have the best of the policies, best of the laws, but when it comes to, implementing them, or, jointly, because this is not a domain of a particular ministry or of a particular department of the government. There are various ministries and departments involved. So I think that is very critical. And from my perspective, I would want to see more of that alignment and integration between the government departments when they are coming up with policies or laws, and then when they are implementing them. That is a very important point, at least from my perspective, and what I hope to see going forward. The other thing I think that I kind of talked about was this whole thing about, again, from an Indian perspective, we have an advantage. We have an opportunity to say so, where businesses are looking to diversify. So why not? Why shouldn't India be a destination? And what can be done with respect to that, or making India an attractive destination for that? And I'm sure government has taken initiatives. The key one being this production linked incentive scheme, which again is WTO compliant, because a lot of other earlier schemes were not WTO compliant. So this is a scheme which is WTO compliant. We have the opportunity right now. So I would want to see that also playing out more on ground, in the sense that we are able to attract some of these manufacturing supply chains to India. And the last point, that again, because I work very closely with a lot of technology companies. I think technology startups. I think even in logistics, I think there would be opportunities for India-based startups, or India to have that ecosystem of startups. So I think hopefully we'll see a lot of companies in technology, in logistics related technology coming out of India. So yeah, so that's some of the points.
I think excellent. So I think we all agree that we should be in an upbeat mood, and logistics and supply chain, at least as a sector, will be booming, not only in India but also abroad, globally, because there is a surge, or there is a demand, whether you're the destination country or a manufacturing country. And one keyword that I take away from this particular panel is the goods should be moving seamlessly. How it happens is left to experts like yourself, and also among the participants there are a number of youngsters. Probably, be creative, and or otherwise look into it, to provide solutions or come up with solutions where goods continue to move in a seamless manner, and that also reflect how strong your supply chains are, across the globe. So with that, I thank each and everyone, and apologies that we have taken a bit longer than expected. But thank you once again to each of you. And Pinaki sir, I know I hijacked last part of the panel, but I know that you're moving, so I hope that's up. So thank you again to each of
Sagar,
you.
that is cross hijacking.
Cross hijacking, yes,
But
sir.
thank you very much to all the panelists, and it was really amazing listening to all of you. I'm sure the audience has gained a lot in terms of insights, and they will put it to good use. Thank you very much, and have a very, very happy new year ahead.